Welcome to module 10, where we're going to continue our discussion on the circulatory system. So with chapter 7 in the last module, we discussed blood, all of the components of blood, functions of those components, and kind of how those different cells and components are regulated in the body. With this module, we're going to finish our discussion on the circulatory system, and we're going to focus on the other three or the other two parts of the circulatory system, which is the heart and the blood vessels. And so we're going to spend some time talking about the blood vessels, so the veins, the arteries, the capillaries. Then we'll look at the heart. Then we'll look at what runs the cardiac cycle, so how does our body regulate it. We'll look at blood pressure, and then we'll finish up with discussing some of the diseases that can affect the blood vessels and the heart. And so after this chapter, chapter 8, we'll be done with the circulatory system. Okay. All right. So first thing we're going to talk about with the heart and blood vessels are the blood vessels themselves. Now, we have three major types of blood vessels. We have the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. Okay. The arteries carry blood away from the heart. The veins bring blood back to the heart. And the way that I remember this is I always think of kind of AA, so arteries away. And then if you know that arteries carry blood away, you know that veins carry blood back. Now, in between arteries and veins, you have capillaries. Capillaries are much, much smaller compared to the arteries and veins in terms of diameter. And they are a single cell tissue layer so that diffusion of oxygen, carbon dioxide, ions, and other molecules can diffuse from the blood vessels, so from those capillaries, into and out of the cells and into and out of the blood. Now, there is a difference between the arteries and veins in terms of how thick they are, in terms of the tissue layers that make up the veins. So arteries are actually thick-walled vessels, and veins are thin-walled vessels. Okay? And the reason this is because if you imagine the heart is pumping, right? So when the heart contracts, squeezes in, it pushes blood out. That blood has a pressure because it's being forced out of the heart. That pressure is higher in arteries than it is in veins because the veins are just returning to the heart via the pressure that's exerted for the blood being pushed out. And so the most pressure in arteries is closer to the heart, whereas veins have a lower amount of pressure on those tissue layers. So because of that, your arteries have a much thicker outer layer and middle layer compared to the veins. Right? And you can see that middle smooth muscle layer in the veins is much thinner compared to the arteries. Same thing with the outer layer, which is a connective tissue. Now that inner layer, the endothelium, is pretty much a single cell layer of inner lining. Now this opening here that is in the arteries and the veins and also the capillaries, so that hollow interior, we'll refer to it as a lumen. So that's called the lumen. And so because the veins are much thinner, they have a larger lumen than the arteries. So that means more blood can pass through. Now, as the blood, or I should say the vessels, move away from the heart and get closer to the capillaries, their diameter becomes smaller. Right? And again, so that's because the capillaries are really only a single epithelial layer of cells thick. And what you see is that larger diameter of those vessels closer to the heart, smaller once they get to the capillaries. So that larger diameter is referred to as the artery or the vein, right? So it's larger here. Then as it gets smaller, closer towards the capillaries, so like right here, then they're referred to as arterioles or venules, and then they will interact with the capillaries themselves. Okay. Now, the direction of blood flow, as we'll learn, goes from the heart through the arteries, through the arterioles, into the capillaries where all of the stuff is exchanged with the cells and then waste products are picked up. And then it moves from the capillaries into the venules, through the veins, and then back into the heart. And so that's the overall distribution for the circulatory system. Now it's a little more complicated in actually how the blood flows, because as we'll learn, there are two circulatory systems. You have the systemic and the pulmonary circuits, and one goes to the lungs and one goes to the tissues. And so this circuit is bringing the blood to the tissues and back to the heart. So this would be the systemic circuit. Okay? But you have the same thing or you do have the same thing in the pulmonary circuit when it goes to the lungs, because there are capillaries in the lungs that surround the alveoli, which we'll learn about. Okay. Now, like we said, arteries transport blood away from the heart. So AA, arteries away. Again, like we mentioned, there's thick-walled 3 layers. The innermost layer is an endothelium of epithelial cells, so those squamoses. So remember, the squamoses are egg-shaped. The middle layer is smooth muscle, and the outer layer is connective tissue. So this is really similar in the veins. And the arteries, not only are they carrying the blood away, but they also carry that blood under pressure, again, because of the heart pushing that blood out into the arteries. Now, because that blood is under much more pressure, arteries can form what's known as aneurysms. And this is a defect in the artery wall, where it basically is a weakening in the artery wall that allows blood to basically expand in between the layers of the artery wall, leading towards this ballooning structure like we see here. So a lot of the times they'll balloon outwards, but sometimes they actually can balloon inwards, and if that happens, they'll obstruct the flow of blood in that artery. These tend to develop over time, and you really don't know you have them until they rupture and you start getting blood loss internally. And you can get aneurysms in your brain, which is where a lot of fatalities happen. So aneurysm can rupture in your brain and cause a loss of blood to your brain, and can really be fatal. And so another one is like your aortic aneurysm, so around the aorta, can lead to a lot of internal bleeding, and can really be fatal very quickly. Now, if you take an image and the doctors actually catch the aneurysms early, before they rupture, they can be surgically repaired. So they can be removed, they can be clamped off, etc. And so they can be caught and treated. It's just most of the time we don't know those aneurysms are there. And again, these aneurysms are a defect that occurs in the artery wall because of the pressure that's exerted on the walls of those arteries. And now we've already mentioned that the blood flow for the circulatory system is from the heart to the arteries, to the arterioles, and into the capillaries. Okay. And so the arterioles, like we showed in that figure, are the smallest arteries, and they're right before the capillary beds. Now, at the kind of intersection of the arterioles and capillaries, so where they meet, there are these smooth muscles that are called precapillary sphincters, so before the capillaries. And these smooth muscles actually control the amount of blood that flows from the arteriole into the capillaries. So they basically serve as like this, you can think of it as like a nozzle on a water hose, right? So they can lower the flow, or they can open the flow, or they can kind of turn it off. And the way that happens is these smooth muscles actually surround the capillaries right where they meet the arterioles. And those precapillary sphincters can either undergo what's known as vasodilation or vasoconstriction. So if they dilate, they're relaxing and they're allowing the capillaries and the blood flow at the arteriole to enter the capillaries. Right? So this increases the blood flow because they're relaxed. Now, if those sphincters constrict and undergo vasoconstriction, then they get tighter, and it's like you're turning the water off, you're turning the blood off into the capillaries, and it decreases the amount of blood flow that goes into those capillaries. Okay, so dilation is relaxation, constriction is contraction. Okay, so here's an image that's showing kind of that process. So you have your arterioles, which is this upper vessel, and you have your capillary bed, which is this network of smaller vessels in between the arteriole and the venule. Now, the blood's going to flow from the arteriole into the capillaries. Right? These smooth muscles here are the precapillary sphincters. Now, they can dilate, undergo vasodilation, like we see here, where they're relaxed and allowing blood flow to enter the capillaries, right? And there are a bunch of cells here that the capillaries are coming into contact with. And so you have stuff moving into the cells, moving out. You have oxygen moving in, carbon dioxide moving out. And then that blood will travel through the capillary and into the venule, and then go into the veins, and then go into the heart. Right. Now, if vasoconstriction happens, so where those precapillary sphincters are constricted, then there's no blood flow into this portion of the capillary bed. Okay? And so they can regulate how much blood flows into the capillaries by either constricting or dilating those sphincters. Okay? And now moving on to the capillaries themselves, so these vessels here, the capillaries are really thin. So they're only a single cell layer thick. They're the smallest blood vessels in our body. They're really microscopic, so you kind of need a microscope to see them. And they're porous, and that those pores allow for the exchange of material. And the diameter of the capillaries is also small as well. So not only are the capillaries one cell layer thick, but the diameter is about the size of a single red blood cell, just a little bit larger. And so that means that, the blood cells are kind of flowing through in a line because they're only one blood cell thick or in diameter. And the capillaries exist not in single, vessels like you see with arterioles and veins, but they're in these networks of capillary beds because they're cells, right, that are all throughout this network of capillaries that they have to interact with. Right? They're allowing that material and oxygen and carbon dioxide to be exchanged. So they exist in those networks. And then the function, again, is to exchange substances with the interstitial fluid. And so basically what you have is, let's say you have a capillary, right? And then you have a cell. All right. They're going to exchange materials into that cell. Okay. so into that area. And it does so by going through the interstitial fluid that is between the vessels and the cells, so this space. Now here we have an image where you have a capillary bed, a network of capillaries with arteries and veins. So these larger ones are like your arteries or your veins, and then these smaller ones here are your capillary beds. Right? So if we zoom in to say this capillary bed here, you can see that they're actually somewhat transparent because they're only a cell layer thick. You actually can see the red blood cells inside. You can see the nucleus, right? So there's a nucleus. There's a nucleus. And these red blood cells are traveling through those capillaries and exchanging material with the interstitial fluid. And if we look at an artist's rendition of this figure here, you see the different cells. Right? Those cells have slits in between for communication, for movement of material. They have pores for movement of material. They have the nucleus, which is represented by that purple organelle, and then your red blood cell that's traveling through. And so we said that with capillaries, the key kind of function is the exchange of material. So the way that happens is you have your arteriole, right, where blood's flowing, precapillary sphincter that's regulating that blood flow, and you have blood flowing into the capillary, right? And then once it leaves the capillary, it goes into the venule. Now, as it's traveling, as the blood is traveling through this capillary, there's a diffusion gradient, there's osmotic gradients, and then there's active transport molecules, proteins that are causing material to move from the capillary into this interstitial fluid and into the cell. Okay? And so you have things like oxygen, nutrients, raw materials for molecules moving into the cell, and then you have carbon dioxide and waste moving out of the cell. Okay? And then they will be transported via the veins to where they will be taken to the respiratory system to be excreted or exhaled, such as carbon dioxide, and other waste may be transported to things like the liver, the spleen, the kidney, depending on what type of waste needs to be removed from the body. Now, the space here where this fluid and water is located actually has a gradient, right? And so water will be lost because there's more water here than here. So water will be lost, right? And so as remember, actually osmosis, right, is that solute gradient, right? So it will flow out. It's not more water; it's following the solutes, basically, right? So more solutes, so it goes out, and then as blood travels down, then water will be forced back in due to that osmotic gradient. And so that helps to kind of make sure the blood volume is maintained. And this, in combination with the lymphatic system, helps to keep that blood volume present. And so the lymphatic system, in combination with this osmotic gradient that happens, keeps the blood at a specific volume and maintains that homeostasis. So it returns any excess interstitial fluid back to the circulatory system. And as you're probably aware, the lymphatic system also helps with immune defenses. We'll talk more about that later. But the interstitial fluid makes up what's known as lymph, which is the material that's kind of flowing through the lymphatic system. And the structure of the lymphatic system is basically these blind-ended capillaries right? It's almost like dead end capillaries, and lymphatic vessels that are really similar to the venous system, so the veins. And again, it's carrying that lymph around the body, helping keep blood volume constant, and then also helping with immune defenses and immune responses. Now, moving from the capillaries and arteries, we're now going to look at veins, which is how the blood returns back to the heart. So again, just like the arteries, there are 3 layers, but they're much more thin-walled in terms of each tissue layer compared to the arteries because they're not experiencing such a high pressure. That means they have a larger lumen, so hollow space, compared to the arteries, and they're kind of flexible. They're distendable, meaning that they can kind of flex and move. And so their function is to bring blood to the heart, so back to the heart after it's picked up or dropped off whatever material it's supposed to. And it also depends on the specific part of the circulatory system. So like veins in the systemic will bring back deoxygenated blood, and veins in the pulmonary system will bring back oxygenated blood. And we'll learn about that in a few minutes. And so the blood flow for the veins is leaving the capillaries to the venules, to the veins, and to the heart. And the veins can actually, or actually do, not can, they do serve as a blood volume reservoir, and it kind of holds blood in our body as it's rotating through the circulatory system. And so since the blood in the veins aren't under such a high pressure like the blood in the arteries are, because they're not directly tied to the heart pushing it out, there are 3 mechanisms that help the blood return back to the heart. One is the contraction of skeletal muscles, and we'll kind of show how that happens in the next slide. And the contraction of the skeletal muscles basically push the blood upwards towards the heart or downward towards the heart, depending on the direction. But if it's moving downward, gravity can kind of help that. The difficult part is like whenever it's moving from the feet back up to the heart. And you can imagine, like, if you have, I'm thinking of popsicles because it's hot and my kids are eating popsicles all the time. But those popsicles are in like the clear tubes. You push on them and it pushes the popsicle up, right? So that's basically what's happening. The skeletal muscles are contracting on the vessels, on the, not vessels, but yeah, vessels, the veins specifically, causing the blood to be pushed up. And what prevents that blood from moving back down are one-way valves. Right, so those, as the blood passes a valve, it basically closes and that blood can't move back down. And then there are pressure changes that we create in our body as we breathe, and that pressure makes blood move towards the heart as well. So as we breathe in and out, the pressure in our thoracic cavity will change, and that causes blood to move back up to the heart. And so to show kind of the veins and the one-way valves and the contraction of the skeletal muscles, we have this figure here. Right, so here we have a vein, right, with the one-way valves closed. Right, notice that that they're shaped to where blood can only enter this way; it can't go back down. And so, as you walk, your calves will contract, and that will squeeze on the vein, and that will push the blood upwards. So the blood will go up through that valve, but it can't move back because that valve will close. And so as you continue to move and do things, your skeletal muscles will push on those veins, and it will cause the blood to go back up to your heart. Okay. And so that's a system that helps to push the blood back whenever there's not a lot of pressure, because by the time the blood runs, say, from the heart down into the capillaries at the bottom of your foot and exchanges material, there's not a lot of pressure left to bring that back up, and you also have gravity pushing down, and so our body needs a mechanism to kind of help bring that blood back up to the heart. Okay. All right. So that does it for our first video with Chapter 8 module. We'll move into the second video after this, where we will look specifically at the heart. We'll talk about the different components of the heart, and we'll talk about how blood flows in and out of the heart and the two major kind of systems in the circulatory system, the pulmonary system and the systemic system. Okay. And so with that, we'll see you in the next video.